think it's time for me to introduce our keynote speaker for this live stream. I could not be more happy to welcome Magnus Hagander. I hope I pronounced his name right. I always ask him if I did it right. Magnus is a member of the Postgres Core Team. He's based in Europe, but his presence is global. And he's also, I think are you president of the Postgres Europe board? Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And I first met you at PGConf EU because you're generally very involved in the organization of that conference, which is the largest Postgres conference in Europe, held every year until the pandemic, right?
Correct. And if all things go according to plan, we will be back again this year after summer, back in October. So, cross our fingers to see that that actually happens, but that is the plan, back in person.
I can't wait. I can't wait to see you all again in person. So you're here to give a keynote about how Postgres is more relevant than ever. And I can't wait to see what you have to say. So with that, we'll pass the baton to you. You're on.
Thank you very much. So yeah, today's topic, Postgres, more relevant than ever. What does that mean? And how did I come to that conclusion? Well, as Claire said, my name is Magnus Hagander. I work for a company called Red Pill Linpro, based not just in Europe, but in Stockholm, in Sweden, where we do all sorts of open source services kind of business, where Postgres is one of our main tracks, where we do support, we do training, we do pure consulting and things like that. So this talk is partially drawing on my experience as a Postgres consultant, simply throughout. Within the Postgres group, as Claire said, I'm a member of the core team. I'm one of the developers, though I don't necessarily do as much as I'd like all the time. I'm part of far too many teams to list, like working on infrastructure and things like that. And finally, I am on Postgres Europe, which deals with advocacy things focused around Europe. The way Postgres works is we have different groups around the world. So there is a corresponding Postgres US, for example, for the Americas, things like that. So also drawing on what I hear in my role in the community and see how do we come to this conclusion. So Postgres, we all know it, right? Hopefully everybody who's listening in on this stream has run into Postgres at some point or other. Postgres is old. Postgres has been around for a long time. It's coming up on 40 years. That's not young anymore. And this is, fairness, this is when we're counting Postgres, the old Berkeley project, which existed for a while before the PostgreSQL that we have today came out. But even with PostgreSQL, it's kind of old. Or is it really old, or does that really just mean experienced? A lot of the things that we see and hear around are things that happened a long time ago in Postgres, or that we go like, yeah, that's not really new. But throughout this time, and I myself got involved in Postgres, not back in the Berkeley days, but I've been in Postgres for a bit over 20 years at different levels. Started as a user, became more of a developer, and then eventually turned into doing Postgres on a professional basis. And to steal a quote that I think is originally very often stolen and misquoted, or misattributed, so I just go ahead and misquote it and say the reports of the imminent death of Postgres have been often repeated. Like throughout the time that I have worked with Postgres, at a regular basis, people have said, no, Postgres is dead. There is no future here. We can't get anywhere, right? Just give up, go away, start doing something else. And this started, so my first experiences with Postgres were back in the 90s, purely as a user at the time. And if you looked at what people were saying then about Postgres and about other things, are things like, the people are building, like, this is just a hobby. You can't use this professionally. Nobody serious would ever use open source, right? And that was not just Postgres. They said that about everything. It's all, shady hackers hacking around, like nobody professional deals with this. And again, this covered other things than Postgres, right? And even at the time, most of the internet as it was running on open source, but people just didn't know. There were a bunch of things running on Postgres back then. People just didn't know as much. But the argument that you got a lot was that you can't really use open source. It doesn't take you anywhere. And as you move through time, the next sort of big era and the next round of Postgres is pointless. came through the dot-com days, which, I mean, yes, there was overlap. This started in the 90s, but we got the general idea, right? In the dot-com days, Postgres is too slow was a common argument. Postgres is too hard to use. Postgres doesn't have replication. Postgres has all of these features, like foreign keys and guaranteed data integrity and all of those things, but nobody needs those. Nobody wants those. We should build that at a different layer. It shouldn't be in the database at all. And there are no providers out there. Like every web host will provide competing products. Nobody will provide Postgres. And in fairness, some of these things are perfectly valid points. Postgres was, relatively speaking, slow for the typical workloads we had at the time. I wouldn't agree that it was necessarily too hard to use, but it was different to use. It did have replication. It just wasn't built in. So that was harder to use. Integrity should not be managed by the app. That's just wrong. And there were fewer providers available at the time. Postgres just wasn't as popular, and that sort of fueled itself. And then as we moved on, the next step after .com, so we get into the, however you pronounce this, I don't really know, but the beginning of the new century. What was the thing then? Well, I literally, and I heard this was around the time when I got involved in Postgres on a more professional basis, I literally heard people complain that Postgres is so cheap that it cannot be good. I don't, but yeah, that's what they said. And there's nobody to support it. And the big argument that I heard a lot about in this time was that Postgres will die from the fact that it doesn't have funding. And what was mostly meant by that is that there was no venture capital funded startup based on Postgres until there was, right? But at the beginning of the double O's, at least there weren't any that people knew of. And that in itself would kill Postgres. And it wouldn't be able to survive throughout this, right? And then we move on to the 2010s. And what happened in the 2010s? Well, in the 2010s, relational is dead again, right? Throughout, and I hear this from people who've been in the database industry much longer than me, that the number of times that the death of relational databases have been predicted is much higher than this. But again, in the 10s, we heard a lot of this because everything was now supposed to be either a distributed key value store or a document database, right? And relational is only legacy. All these old dinosaurs, whether they're open source or proprietary dinosaurs, they're still dinosaurs. They're all going to die. They're all going to go away. Nobody's ever going to use it. Okay, yeah, sure. And then as we move on, the next thing that we saw, still in the 10s, I guess, but towards the end, that people start talking about cloud and databases in the cloud and databases for the cloud. And that's one thing. But the arguments that I started hearing through that is now things that now that everything is in the cloud, nobody cares what database you use, which I kind of think it's an interesting point. What do you mean don't care? Like the cloud is where you run things. It's not necessarily what you run. And they're saying all regular databases that are not purely cloud-based services are dying. There's a common thing here. They're all called dinosaurs. They're all legacy, and they're all going to die. And these things have repeated throughout the whole time that I have worked with Postgres. Again, starting as a hobbyist, going into more as a user, and then doing it on a professional level. These have all said, like these things all come down. There are different reasons all over, and they're all come to the conclusion that Postgres is dead. Or at least, it's probably dead already. It just hasn't noticed it yet. So my question to you then is, did it happen? Like, is Postgres dead today? Does it appear dead? Is it kind of like the reverse of this, the Monty Python parrot sketch with a dead parrot? Kind of, a little bit like that. So I'll quickly zoom back to a time about 15 years ago. This may actually be slightly closer to 20 years ago. I don't remember exactly, but it's in the area of 15 to 20 years ago. I had a discussion about these things, around one of these things where everybody said that Postgres was going to die. They're never going to break into the enterprise market, and they're losing out everywhere else, and all of that is going away. And a good friend of mine and a senior Postgres contributor said more or less this at the time. He said, one day Microsoft will put out their own version of Postgres. And that's when we know that we won. And this was, back in the days when open source was still fighting Microsoft, when Microsoft was very much, Windows enterprise installations and open source is evil. And we had some terrible quotes coming out of the organization. A very different Microsoft than what we're seeing today. So back in those days, and the deal then was that, eventually even the mighty Microsoft will, buckle under and start talking about Postgres. So one day, Microsoft will put out their own versions of Postgres, and that's when we have won. This is on Microsoft's website today, right? This is azure.microsoft.com. I count 1, I count 2, I count 3 versions of Postgres from Microsoft. Not just one, right? They've had one version for a while. We're now up to, we have their slightly older single server, we have flexible server, and we have the Citus hyperscale, which is technically not a different Postgres. It's a Postgres packaged with an extension that turns it into a distributed database. So not just 1, but 3. So per the argument of this person from 15 to 20 years ago, that means we've won. That's pretty cool. I like winning. Doesn't necessarily matter whether we've won or not, but I think we can say from the perspective of our survival that we have won, right? Postgres is not dead. Postgres is not dying. Postgres is growing. And it keeps growing. It keeps getting into more places. How did that happen? How come throughout all of these years, all the predictions of the death of Postgres have failed? Why is Postgres popular today? Why are we where we are at today? Well, I mean, we can't argue the fact, yes, price certainly matters. Particularly, a number of years ago, one of the main arguments, like whenever I, as a consultant or as a training or whatever I did for my company towards our customers, price was always one of the arguments. It was always, we need to get away from, insert name of proprietary vendor here that is too expensive for us. Postgres is good enough, but it's cheap. Right? That was a good start. But if I look to where things are today, I mean, price still matters. Sure, nobody wants to pay more than they have to for anything. But it's nowhere near as important an argument as it once used to be. And I think that's key to how Postgres got to where it is, because we have a lot more arguments than just the price. And I think this is one of the important parts around Postgres. Postgres is based on a permissive license. It is a do whatever you want license. It is a sell whatever you want license. It is a package whatever you want license. It is a anything goes, almost. Like the restrictions that are put on you as a consumer, as a user of Postgres, are almost none. The restrictions that are put on you as a reseller or as a hosted platform provider, anything like that on Postgres, are almost none. And this leads to not restricting our architectures, which I personally think is very important. I've seen throughout my years working with other products that far too often when people are designing the architecture of the system that they want to build, they do it under the constraints of this server that sits over here, there can only be one of them and it cannot have more than 2 CPU cores because it gets too expensive, or because then we end up doing this, or we can't use this particular feature because then we have to pay for the enterprise edition, or or our support contract across our entire organization for other things get affected and things like that. And the Postgres license lets you do whatever you want. You will never pay for Postgres itself, and you will never be told what to do. Now, you will be buying services around Postgres, whether it's support or hosting or anything, and they may add restrictions, they may add prices, they may add whatever they want. But that's at the service level. That is not Postgres itself. So having this flexibility has allowed people to do a lot of things with Postgres that they otherwise couldn't. And the other thing that I think is key to Postgres survival is that the project itself, at the core, it started from a very solid product. It has been solid for a long time, and it stayed true to its roots. Don't panic, don't do this. Oh no, you have to change to do it this way right now or you're dead forever. That has come. The Postgres project had basically just ignored that and kept plodding along on the path that it was already on. It keeps adding features, it keeps improving things. It is a slow rate. Yes, sometimes it can be super frustrating. You cannot see a roadmap. You don't know what's going to show up in 2 years' time. But there is continuous progress that has just left us at a place like that. And yes, Postgres is still playing catch up. There are still features in Postgres, or sorry, features in other databases that Postgres doesn't have, particularly when we're talking about big enterprise players. But there is almost always something chipped off in every version. For example, the upcoming version of Postgres that we hope to put out after summer will finally have support for the merge command, doing full-on merge. And some people will go, well, we don't need that. We have, insert on conflict and things. And like, no, we need it. It solves a different problem. There are still more things to do. And these are good for moving systems, moving people, and moving organizations from existing solutions onto Postgres. And we do see a lot of that. Another killer that I think for Postgres is developer flexibility. And I'm not talking about the developers who build Postgres. I'm talking about developers who are building applications that are using Postgres. Because Postgres is good at integrating new technology, at integrating things. They often come to Postgres before they come to a bunch of other places. These days, it hasn't always been true, but it is. If you look at the Postgres JSON support, it's very early on. It is very powerful. It is, in my opinion, significantly better than most other databases. Maybe not all, but we're talking relational. Postgres range types is an extremely powerful concept that, sadly, I don't think anyone else has. They really should, because it is really, really useful. We have PostGIS as a great example of an external project that integrates deeply with Postgres to provide functionality that is really hard to find elsewhere and drives developer adoption. And the thing that is important through this, and the thing that Postgres has at least mostly done here, is integrate with the new technology, don't replace it. Right? You still have this solid core of a traditional relational database in the middle. You have your regular, integers and strings and whatnot, that everything works. And then you can just integrate these new things on top of it. And the way that Postgres does it is using this extension-based system, so that things like PostGIS doesn't even have to be built inside Postgres. You can just plug it in and it will integrate to a deep level, whereas other things live directly inside of the core database. I think this flexibility is key to getting a developer mindshare, right? Yes, there's a large set of developers who will build everything through their ORM, but once they graduate from that and start doing more native database things, then this flexibility becomes a great value. And Postgres also comes with a deployment flexibility because it runs everywhere. You're hard-pressed to find somewhere where you cannot run Postgres if you want to. And this is an important flexibility for wherever you go. If you look at the existing cloud providers, Postgres runs on all of them. There are managed Postgres services on all the major cloud providers. There are managed Postgres services on most of the minor cloud providers. You can always run Postgres in a virtualized environment on a cloud provider. You can run it within whatever you call it, these automatic scaling features of the respective providers. It sort of just works. And having a system that integrates well with the operating system used on the clouds helps. Having the permissive license also helps because, for example, if you want your system to automatically scale up and down the number of replicas available in a system, that's kind of hard to do if you have to sign a new license contract every time you want to scale up, for example. So the flexibility comes back. It goes in. Obviously, a lot of people still run their stuff on premise. Postgres works fine there. It works in your traditional deployments, whether they're physical, whether they're VM. It integrates now. It's popular to run Postgres in Kubernetes or using whichever management tool on top of Kubernetes that people prefer. And it does so with very few caveats. Right? It tends to sort of just work. Now, personally, I may not think that most of the people who run Postgres in Kubernetes really should not be running Postgres in Kubernetes because don't. Right? It's much harder than you think. But for some of them, it is the right choice. It's there. You choose where to run it, and that just works. And having this flexibility for deployments as well means you can run it locally. You can then move to the cloud. You can move from the cloud. You can move between different providers. As long as it's all Postgres, it just works. And this is an excellent way today to stay relevant in the marketplace because people want the ability to move. And yes, putting things in some of the systems that our big cloud providers provide today is like the worst kind of lock-in you ever saw. When Postgres got started and when a lot of the open source movement got started, the idea was we need to break free of the lock-in of the proprietary vendors, at the time, primarily Microsoft. And the kind of lock-in that a lot of people are building themselves into now on big cloud vendors is often worse. But if they're running Postgres on the big cloud vendor, that lock-in suddenly becomes much, much smaller. And I have numerous clients who have chosen Postgres partially for that very reason, who've said, we're okay with this lock-in because it runs Postgres, because we can move our stuff out if we want. Whether they're ever going to do that, sure. But having the ability to do that is an important part to be able to move these things through. So where does that actually leave us? Where are we today? And I'm going to bring in another quote that came up recently, which is, Postgres has emerged as the API for operational databases. This was part of an announcement from Google, from the Google Cloud Spanner team, where they've taken their decisively non-Postgres database, Cloud Spanner, and added a Postgres compatibility layer on top of it, basically. Because that's what their customers want. Their customers want to speak the Postgres protocol. They want their database to look like Postgres. They don't want it to be separate. And I think reaching this point where one of the major vendors in the market just called our product basically emerged as the standard API is a good way to define that you're relevant in the market. And in the end, where we are at is nobody needs Postgres. And that's the point. Right? Nobody needs Postgres. There are other databases. You can do everything else, where there are very few products in the IT market that anyone needs that really doesn't have any competition. There's a lot of competition in the database space. But what we're seeing more and more today is that everything runs on Postgres. It may not run on standard Postgres. It may run on, AWS Aurora or Citus for scalabilities. It may run on this Cloud Spanner, but there is Postgres somewhere in more and more products, and it runs in the back end. Nobody sees it. It's nice and quiet, and it chugs along and it works. But the reason everything runs Postgres is everything runs Postgres by choice, and I think that's important. Nobody forces anyone to choose Postgres. People choose Postgres because they want to, and it still grows. That's being relevant. And it really is the flexibility, in my view, that has brought Postgres to this point and that keeps us at this point. It is the flexibility for everybody, right? Whether you're a dev, whether you are DevOps, whether you're pure ops, whatever, the flexibility of Postgres to fit in and adapt to what your organization needs is what keeps Postgres relevant. And it is flexible for the whole organization. It is not just for the technical people. Everybody understands the importance of deployment flexibility, of being able to have an agile organization that can change, that can move and things as it is necessary. So it's really Postgres for everybody. It's not just flexibility for everybody. Postgres fits in to solve the problem of getting flexibility for a lot of other things. Postgres can be used as an integration point. Again, a way to stay relevant. Everybody talks to Postgres and exchanges messages or exchanges data through Postgres. And I see a lot of more people wanting it to do that through Postgres than they do through a lot of the competing products these days. So that's going to be my main takeaway from this. Postgres for everybody is really the way for Postgres to be and to stay relevant in the marketplace and to be, as I say, more relevant than ever. This is what got us there. This is what will keep us there. So with that, I'll say thank you very much for listening in, whether you happen to be live or whether you're watching this later. If you are watching this live, and I know Claire said earlier that you can all join us on the Discord. Sadly, the Microsoft Discord server is not in the mood of verifying my account right now, so I can't get in. Sorry about that. But at any time, you can just reach out to me on Twitter, for example, or drop me an email if you have any further questions on this one. And with that, I think, do we have time for, if we have any live questions to go with right now?
We have time for a couple of questions. I know that.
Do we have any?
I actually didn't check the Discord server because I was busy tweeting about your talk. I loved it. I have questions for you about how much this gets discussed among members of the Postgres community, this assertion that Postgres is dead or Postgres is going to die, which sounds like it's been coming up for a very long time now, right? So is it something that you kind of joke about over dinner, but then just focus on doing the work, or does it ever get to be a distraction?
I think that's a pretty good summary. It's certainly something that's every now and then joked about over dinner. And obviously, I mean, people take it seriously to a level that you look at it and see, okay, so these people think we're going to die because of X, so can we fix X, right, for some things? As an example, we saw a big push towards the document-based databases, for example. Well, Postgres that was the time when Postgres learned, well, let's add the ability to do document database inside of Postgres, and again, with this flexibility, combine it with a traditional relational database and run both at once. So the group is certainly paying attention to these things, but some of them, some of them are just ridiculous. But you have to, and they just stay as the dinner jokes. Whereas for the rest, sure, there is value in the input as well. So certainly people listen to that input as well as other input.
Well, I certainly got a kick given that, we're hosting this event from Microsoft, you including the Microsoft quote, which I took a picture of because I wanted to, although I think I have a copy of your slides, don't I? So I'm sure I could look it up online, but I want to read it out loud again. Let's see, where is it? One day Microsoft will put out their own version of Postgres, and that's when we have won. It's kind of cool. And I
like the quote, and I really like the fact that we got to that point.
Yeah, and I think that was back in, was it 2018 that Azure Database for Postgres, the managed service, first came out. And I wasn't at Microsoft at the time because I joined as part of the Citus acquisition, but pretty darn cool.
Yeah, and now there's 3.
Oh, 3 deployment options, you mean, in Azure?
Yeah, I mean, they're each, as with all of these managed services, whether it's Azure, AWS, or Google, they're ever so slightly forked versions of Postgres to adapt to the cloud platform. So technically, they are actually 3 different versions of Postgres, though they're designed to look the same to the developer.
Okay. There is a question that I'm getting on the chat that pivots us in a different direction. And you mentioned Kubernetes and running Postgres in Kubernetes before. So I feel like this could be a rat hole that takes us into a 15-minute discussion, which we don't have time for. But I'm going to ask it anyway, because maybe you have a short and succinct answer. Otherwise, we'll end up having to take it on over in the Discord server once we get your login fixed, which we will as soon as Aaron wakes up. He's asleep. What can be the caveats in running Postgres in Kubernetes? This is from somebody who is studying alternative ways to scale out their monolithic multi-tenant app, and they want to know more. Postgres
in general, I mean, obviously, as you say, we can easily spend 20 minutes on just that topic, but most of it comes down to simply complexity, right? Kubernetes is very complex. It is relatively easy to deploy and scale stateless services for it, but to scale and properly manage a stateful service, in particular one that you need to tune for performance of the individual node, can be very complex in Kubernetes. If you have lots of instances, it pays off. But I see a lot of people who have, we only have a primary and a standby setup and we want to run it on Kubernetes. And if you only have that, you're going to be paying so much more in complexity than you ever get back. You have to get to a fairly large number of instances in your scale before you get payout for the complexity to manage it, I think is the summary. And I'll be happy to discuss more details around it later once I figure my way into the Discord.
Okay, sounds great. I want to thank you. I am so happy you said yes and that you joined us today. I think your talk was really interesting, particularly for people who've only been involved in Postgres for a couple of years. You've got that historical perspective, and thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And I'll be curious to see if the person who gave me that quote many years ago remembers it and if he was actually listening into this stream. So if you did, you know who you are. Just give me a ping. It'll be fun to know. All right. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Magnus.
Let's look forward to the rest of the day.